Welcome back. This is our third in the Quick Start Guide to getting your class up and running. In this session, we're going to look specifically at pedagogies. One of the most familiar tools for teachers will be lecture, and lecture can be done online just as it can be face-to-face. Although the slide begins here with synchronous, I'm going to flip this all the way through because we really do want you to think about asynchronous learning. For asynchronous lecture, your best tools are going to be Zoom or a Google Chrome extension called Loom. If you search for Loom and Google Chrome extension, you'll find that. These are tools that enable you to record video and make it available to students. If you don't know how to do that in Zoom, please come join one of our Zoom introduction sessions that will be happening later this week, or get in touch with me. Some things to keep in mind as you're doing asynchronous video lecture. It's important to remember camera and audio on both of these. If you are including your own face using a webcam, make sure that your face fills up about 2/3 of the screen. Make sure that your microphone is placed so that your audio comes through clearly. If you are relying on the onboard microphone on your laptop, that's not the best microphone in the world, but it will work. Just be sure that you're in a quiet location so that students aren't hearing too much background noise. Keep in mind that your visuals for any kind of online lecture need to be such that students actually can read them. You may have students who are experiencing this on their phone, and if you have text-heavy slides, they're not going to work. So keep your visuals to images or keywords. Remember that students have short attention spans. Remember that humans have short attention spans, and best practices tell us to try to break your videos up into 6 or 7 minute chunks. If you can't do that, remind students to pause the video periodically, to take a break from it and then come back to it. Student engagement with asynchronous video can be hard to measure. You don't have the visual cues. So you will want to intersperse your video lectures with other kinds of activities to involve students in the work. It might be a written reflection assignment on the first 5 or 7 minutes of a lecture. It might be a short quiz to measure whether they are comprehending the information. Find other ways to involve them. When we think about synchronous online lecture, many of the same concerns are there. Student engagement can be a little bit different because you actually can see your students. Remind your students, though, that their pictures are pretty small on your screen. There is a participants button in Zoom if you're using Zoom. Remind students that if they click that, they then have options for raising their hand, lowering their hand, asking you to slow down, and that those non-visual cues can be exceptionally helpful for the person who is doing the lecture. You have breakout rooms in Zoom. This is a good way to encourage engagement. Lecture for 5 to 7 minutes, then send them to breakout rooms to answer a question for a few minutes, then bring them back for more of the lecture. Student discussion in an online course. Asynchronous learning, as I mentioned earlier in the previous video, there are tons of tools out there that facilitate this. Don't overburden your students with new tools, though. Canvas discussions will probably be perfectly sufficient. Posting threaded discussion forums that students can reply to. Couple of things with this, whether synchronous or asynchronous, remember that the question matters. If you're asking fact-based questions or questions that are too broad and vague, you're likely not going to get the kind of learning that you want. So I'll offer an example. Imagine that I have had students read the first chapter of Charles Dickens's Bleak House, and I post in a discussion forum, "You've finished reading the first chapter, please discuss." If I'm really willing to get anything at all from students, that might work, but generally I want learning to be a little more specific than that. I might be better off with a question like, "You've read the first chapter of Bleak House. The first paragraph is filled with images of fog and dinosaurs. Why do you think Charles Dickens chose to do that, and what effect did it have on your reading?" Much more specific, but still open-ended enough to generate good discussion. A couple of other tips for asynchronous discussions. Clarify your expectations. Let students know how long their posts need to be, how many posts they need to make, how many responses to classmates. Clarify your role. Are you just going to listen in and then synthesize at the end? Or are you going to be an active participant in the discussion? It helps for students to know that. Synthesize the learning. One complaint that students have about discussion forums is that they are busy work. And they will perceive it that way unless you as the instructor find a way to make the learning happen. I would recommend having students write a paragraph or two explaining the key learning that they got from the discussion, and then following up with your own response, synthesizing what they should have learned. Finally, for discussion forums asynchronously, stagger the deadlines if you're going to require responses. Otherwise, if you just post an assignment that asks students to make one original post and reply to 2 classmates, all of that is due on Friday at midnight. Probably at about 11:30 p.m. Friday, you're going to start seeing posts showing up, and the responses and conversation will be terrible. Better to say original posts due by noon on Wednesday with follow-up replies due by midnight on Friday. For synchronous discussion, Zoom is going to be your best tool for this. Same kind of concerns with camera, microphone, asking the right questions. Again, remind the students to use those nonverbal interactions. A couple of other tips though. Don't be afraid to give some silence in a session. Just tell them what you're doing. We're going to take 30 seconds to pause and let you formulate a response before we begin discussion. Or we're going to take 5 minutes. I want you to write, and then we'll come back for discussion. You may need to direct the interactions in this. Calling on students directly, inviting a specific student to respond to something that another student has said. Otherwise, your participants may just kind of hang out in the background. Finally, use the breakout rooms for group discussions. You can put students in groups of 4 or 5 and have them discuss amongst themselves. You can pop in and listen, contribute, and then move on to another group. Same kinds of things with synthesizing the learning as well. Please find a way at the end of a discussion to help students see what it was that they were supposed to have learned. Group work and group projects can be carried out in an online space. They do present some challenges. The first is that you need to find a way to create a space for our students to work. In an asynchronous class session, Google Suite is a great way to do this, using a Google Doc that students can work on and then leave, and then another student logs in and does some work on it. Google Slides presentations, the whole Google Suite is really good for this. Canvas allows for students to create group sites, or for you to put them in groups, and then they have a space in which to work where they can create their own wikis, they can create their own discussion forums. My experience has been that students don't particularly like the Canvas interface, but it's out there. For synchronous group work, Zoom is going to be a great space. Every student at Lenore-Rhine has a Zoom account, so they can log into Zoom. They can create their own Zoom meetings without you being present. You may want to send them the 2-page handout to Zoom that is at the back of the Quick Start Guide manual that is on the Center for Teaching and Learning's site. Google creates a great synchronous space as well. You can work on a Google document or slides presentation together. And I think with both synchronous and asynchronous, you can also let the students figure out what works for them. They've got all kinds of tools that we don't know about that they use. Text messaging, for instance, I guess we do know about that, but they will find creative ways to do this. Some additional principles for group work. For collection, Zoom can be a great space to assess presentations or even some collaborative projects in a synchronous fashion. Just have your students log into Zoom at the same time that you do. Asynchronously, students can record a presentation and send the link to you. Again, see the Zoom help files that we've created. A narrated PowerPoint or Google slide can be a good way for students to work together to talk about and show you the kind of work that they're doing. Some notes on some special circumstances. Oftentimes, group work goes along with experiential learning that's going to be hard to recreate in an online space. If that was your plan, you may want to consider shifting to case studies or simulations. Provide them a reading of a situation that is like what they would have experienced and ask them to do their responses and reflections in response to that. You probably also should ask whether your group work or group projects, whether you need them to learn from the process or whether you actually need to assess the finished product. Oftentimes we use group projects so that students learn from the work of doing it. If that's the case, adjust your rubric to make sure that that's clear to students who are going to be feeling a great deal of anxiety about trying to do a group project in an online space. If you truly are focused on the final product, you're going to need to find some ways to help students overcome that anxiety. Student presentations. Doctors Jeff Delbert and Rebecca Alt were super helpful in thinking this through, and one of their first questions was, why are you doing student presentations? If you're doing it to master course content, maybe there are some other ways that you can have students do that. If you are doing it to have students develop the skills that one learns by creating a presentation, there may be forms that you can use to do that that don't involve a direct presentation. For instance, if you want to see how students organize ideas, the outline for a speech can be just as effective as the speech itself at demonstrating that skill. You may want to take a look at the printed version, the PDF file, quick start guide. There are some additional suggestions there. If it really is to develop the skill of presenting, then you may need to have students present to you synchronously or record themselves and send you the link. So these are just some additional ideas about the non-presentation presentation. All of these things can be done without students actually doing a presentation. You can have them analyze other people's speeches. You can have them create the visuals that they would use for a speech so that you can evaluate that. You can have them write out the script of a speech to show you how they are integrating other people's ideas. You can even have them share a difficult experience with someone in their family or a friend, and then write about that as a way of just getting more comfortable with the idea of talking about hard things. For online presentations, if you really do require presentations, Zoom or their phone will be the best bet for an asynchronous version. Zoom allows you to share the screens. They could work with visual aids. That may be a challenge when working with a smaller screen like a phone. Phones are amazingly flexible, but they do have the limitation of the screen size. But you can have a student turn on the camera and the microphone and record themselves doing a presentation in just about any space that they can get into. Keep in mind that the whole point of moving online is to keep them out of large groups, so I would try to avoid requiring them to do that. Synchronously, Zoom is going to be your best bet, again with the shared screen, and then you can use breakout rooms to give students a chance to practice. Testing in the online environment is a little bit tricky. First question to ask yourself is, are we doing this for formative purposes to help students learn, or is it a summative test to measure what students have learned? Some principles here: always be outcomes based in your testing. If remembering basic vocabulary is not an outcome, then it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to give a multiple choice test that tests whether they remember basic vocabulary. So key your assessments to the outcomes that you have. A number of you are going to be tempted to use proctoring services or our lockdown browser, and really please just say no to that idea. The lockdown browser keeps students from navigating away from the website on which they are taking their test. That sounds great until you think about the fact that in an online environment, they're just going to pull out their phones and look up answers if they wish to cheat. The lockdown browser adds a layer of complexity, and in an online space, it doesn't do anything useful. Proctoring services, at Lenore Ryan, we do work with ProctorU for this. However, those costs are passed directly to students. We require them to swipe a credit card to pay for the proctoring service. And we will get in serious trouble with our accrediting agencies if we add that to student costs mid-semester without having it on the syllabus. So please do not try to use our proctoring services. So how do you test with integrity? Some suggestions. Avoid fact-based tests. If you can find other ways to get them to demonstrate knowledge of the facts, that would be ideal. Vocabulary is a good example. Instead of doing a multiple choice test, ask them to write an essay that requires them to use the vocabulary that you need them to know. Be creative. Best example of this, at Milligan College, where I was an undergraduate, I remember an exam where instead of asking me to summarize the philosophies of Kant, Hume, and Descartes, we got the question, Kant, Hume, and Descartes walk into a coffee shop and have a conversation about blank. I don't remember exactly what the topic was. The exam question was to provide a transcript of the conversation. That's a really hard one just to look up the answer to. You may want to use projects or reflection-based assignments instead of multiple choice tests. You may want to use multiple choice plus tests. Choose the best answer, and then the plus part is explain why you think it's the best answer. Delaying would be a good tactic if we knew that we were only gone for a week or two. Just postpone the exam until we get back. At this point with COVID-19, that's not a good solution. Finally, if you do choose to do kind of the multiple choice tests, 3 suggestions. Use a large question bank, and Canvas help files will show you how to create that in Canvas. Randomize both the order in which questions appear and the order the answers appear. And shorten the testing time frame to give less time for students to look up answers. Always remember, though, that you are still responsible for the accommodations. If a student gets time and a half, you have to give it to them. Those are some suggestions for these specific pedagogies, with apologies that this particular segment of video was way longer than best practices would say. As we noted at the beginning, sometimes we do good